Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Spirit Alive. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I'm the director of Spirit Alive, which is a ministry of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York, whose generosity makes our programs possible. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. Tonight's presentation is the last of our Vatican II series scheduled for the fall, and we are fortunate to have Dr. Catherine Clifford with us. Catherine is a professor of systematic and historical theology at St. Paul's University in Ottawa, Canada, when she joins us by Zoom this evening from her office. She's the author of numerous books and articles focused primarily in the areas of ecclesiology, ecumenism, and the history of the Second Vatican Council. More than a few times over the last few months, people have stopped me and asked why Spirit Alive was doing a series on Vatican II, which, at 60 years removed from our own day, is thought by many people to be irrelevant. Fortunately, we are joined tonight by an expert who is going to consider just such a question and help us understand why Vatican II and its teaching, addressed to a world so different from our own at a different time in a different century, still has significance for us today. After her presentation, Catherine would be happy to answer questions. So during the course of the presentation, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box for Catherine to see and address. And be sure to press the CC icon on your computer if you would like to read along as well as listening to Catherine's presentation. So Catherine, we welcome you and are grateful that you could take the time out of your busy end of the year schedule when everybody's crazy and the students are crazy and their exams to give and papers to mark. So we are very grateful that you could be with us tonight. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Maria. It's really good to be with you. My topic this evening is a council for a world church. The American ecclesiologist Joseph Kamanchak once recounted the story of teaching a group of enthusiastic students at the Catholic University of America. When he asked how many of them knew what Vatican II was, a hush came over the room. His question was met by silence and every teacher's nightmare, blank stares. Rather unnerved, he asked again, "Does no one know what's meant by Vatican II?" A timid hand went up from an earnest young religious sister. "Would that be the Pope's summer residence?" she asked. It quickly dawned on Father Kamanchak that for most students in the 21st century, the Second Vatican Council remains an obscure event in the distant past. It's as foreign to their experience as the 16th century Council of Trent or the 4th century Council of Nicaea. The historic meeting of the world's Catholic bishops from 1962 to 1965 and the many events that followed, which set the course for the renewal of the church and its mission in the modern world, and which shaped the ecclesial imaginary of those of us who lived through it, is a world away from the experience of young Christians and other seekers today. They rightly ask, can a church council called to respond to the challenges facing the church in the mid-20th century still speak to the church and the world of the 21st? In the next hour, I hope to explore this question with you. And to develop my response, I will consider a series of related questions, including, what is a council? And how does one begin to distinguish between its enduring significance and the time-conditioned elements of its teaching? What were the defining features of the world context in the 1960s? And how do they compare with the context of our world today? In the course of our discussion, I will also draw from the interpretation of Vatican II by the German theologian Karl Rahner, who served as an expert advisor to the German-speaking bishops and a peritus during the council. In particular, his assertion that the Second Vatican Council is the moment where we see the first official assertion of a church more deeply aware of itself as a world church. Rahner's insight gives us a framework for understanding the continuing evolution of the church in this new millennium, as the global Catholic Church is called to meet the complex task of becoming more fully enculturated. As we will see, the Council's teaching reflects this new awareness of both the changing social location of the Church in the modern world and of the permanent dialectics between faith and culture that remains the law of evangelization, a dynamic which demands a more intentional and responsible engagement in our time. So the first question, just what is a council and how do we discern its enduring significance? In the long history of the church, the gathered community of God's covenant in Jesus Christ has come together to listen, to pray, to discern, to deliberate whenever it's confronted with new challenges. In the earliest account of such a gathering that we find in chapter 15 of the Acts of the Apostles, we find the early Christian community gathered in Jerusalem to resolve a conflict concerning the necessity of following the prescriptions of the Jewish law, in particular, the practice of circumcision, if one were to receive the gift of salvation in Jesus Christ. This account reflects a conflict between Jewish Christians and Christians of Greek and other cultural origins in the first century. Apostles and elders gathered to listen to the experience of Paul and Barnabas of what God was accomplishing among the Gentiles, forming what they called a new people for God's name, one that transcended the ethnic bounds of the people of Israel. They acted together with the consent of the whole church and sent word following this meeting to the Gentile community to affirm the work of God's Spirit among them and to share their decision to refrain from imposing any unnecessary burdens on non-Jewish converts to the Christian faith. The most solemn exercise of the teaching office of the bishops, acting in concert with the Bishop of Rome, is found in the gathering of an ecumenical council. Their consensus symbolizes and expresses communion in faith among the local churches. That unity in faith is both synchronic, reflected in the consensus of the churches gathered from every corner of the world, and diachronic, reflected as the meaning of the apostolic faith is discerned at a decisive moment in the past, and its enduring significance is carried forward in the living tradition. So this is a unity across space and a unity through time. It goes without saying that every council and its teachings will be shaped by a host of historical, social, and cultural factors which condition both its agenda and its chosen modes of proclamation. When, during the week of prayer for Christian unity in January of 1959, Pope John XXIII declared his intention to call an ecumenical council, he identified two rather traditional aims. First, to bring the church up to date, aggiornamento. And second, The first is a form of church reform, and the second aim, to further the cause of reconciliation between the separated churches, a call to unity in faith. At the time, few saw any pressing doctrinal conflict that required resolution. In his official letter convoking the council on Christmas Day of 1961, Pope John noted what he called, quote, a crisis underway in human society. Humanity, he said, is on the edge of a new era, one that calls for a new response on the part of the church if it hopes to bring the light of the gospel to bear. It was this sense of responsibility, he said, born from his reading the signs of the times, that impelled him to call for a substantial reform of the church. Among those signs of God's Spirit at work, he noted a deepening awareness of the dignity of the human person, a desire, following the devastation of 2 world wars, for peace and stability among the nations. And in the recent establishment of a World Council of Churches, a new effort to foster visible ecclesial unity. These were the signs of the times to which the council must attend. In Pope John's historic speech at the opening of the council's first session on October the 11th of 1962, the Pope was unequivocal. The purpose of a council was not to set aside the tradition or to depart from the truth of the gospel. Nonetheless, because the world was changing, the ways of proclaiming it must be brought up to date and adapted to the present context. What was needed, he insisted, was that the sure doctrine of the church be investigated and presented in the way demanded by our times and using the best of modern methods. He distinguished carefully between what he calls the deposit of faith or the enduring truths of Christian doctrine and the way they are expressed. New ways of speaking, of being church, and of witnessing to the faith, he argued, would require a great deal of work and patience. Pope John referred to this as the pastoral character of the council's teaching, calling the bishops to proclaim the gospel with greater effect. The salient feature of their teaching would be in the effort to speak to contemporary people in a language and in forms better adapted to those who would receive it. The initial preparatory phase of the council had not gone particularly well. Many members of the Roman Curia and theologians of the Roman universities, who largely controlled the agenda of the preparatory process, developed over 70 documents in advance of the bishops' gathering, none of which was very forward-looking. They viewed the council as an opportunity to repeat and now elevate the teachings of the 19th and 20th century popes and endow them with the weight of the council's authority. In response, Pope John argued that it would not be enough to merely restate more forcefully or repeat at length what the fathers and the ancients or more recent theologians have handed on, he said. An ecumenical council would not have been necessary for this. The more important task before them was proclaiming the gospel with effect to a different world, to societies and cultures that had radically changed and continued to evolve at an accelerating pace. Karl Rahner, who provided significant theological advice to Cardinal Franz Koenig of Vienna concerning the documents emerging from the preparatory phase of the council, argued that the council must not only look back at the accumulation of magisterial teaching, but that it must attend to what he called the charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit at work in the life of the church. These charisms or spiritual gifts, he maintained, are not given to the ordained alone, but reside in all the baptized faithful who are called to discern the will of God and take initiative in the world, not waiting simply to carry out the orders of the hierarchy. Indeed, Rahner observed, the gifts and guidance of the Spirit imply at times a burden and even a measure of suffering born out of the dissonance and even opposition to immobility and fixed ways of proceeding. The council would affirm the charismatic nature of the whole church as a spirit-led community when in its dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, it recalled the prophetic character of all those anointed by the Spirit at baptism and reflected in the sense of the faithful that innate capacity for discerning the truth of the gospel. The consensus of the whole church, from the bishops down to the last of the faithful, is a sign and confirmation of the Spirit's guidance. The Spirit whom Jesus promised would continue to teach us and recall all that he had confided to his disciples. For Rahner, this same Spirit was guiding the whole church in its discernment of the presence and action of the Spirit, not only in the church, but in the world, in what Pope John was calling the signs of the times. My second point, the world of Vatican II. What kind of world was this? Less than 20 years had transpired since the end of the Second World War. In the wake of the systemic extermination of 6 million Jews under the Nazi regime, Christian leaders were now challenged to confront the distorting influence of anti-Semitism in Christian preaching and practice. It was the height of the Cold War between the Western Alliance and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis would break out during the first week of the council proceedings, when President Kennedy announced a military blockade following the discovery of Soviet nuclear weapons aimed at major population centers across North America on the island of Cuba. The growing influence of communist regimes reflected the increasing sway of atheism. A new age of global communications was dawning, thanks to the development of satellite technology. And the chastening of European powers in the wars of the 20th century brought an end to direct colonial rule. Between 1945 and 1975, at least 75 countries in Asia and Africa would gain their independence from colonial rule. The world, especially the non-European world, with its diversity of cultures, the non-Roman Church, and the diversity of ecclesial communions, the non-Christian world, and the fact of religious pluralism, these would be the touchstone of the Council's reflections by a church whose reach now extended to the ends of the earth. The French Dominican Yves Congar, who had been named as a consultor to the Council's preparatory theological commission, submitted a remarkable note in response to Pope John's consultation on the conciliar agenda. Lamenting that the questions being considered by that commission resembled more closely those of the First Vatican Council than Pope John's concerns, Congar ventured the following. And here I'm going to read at length from a text, and I'm grateful to the translation provided by Father Joseph Kamanchak here. He writes, everywhere, but especially among Catholic lay people, the announcement of the Second Vatican Council has aroused great interest and great hope, above all because His Holiness has given promoting the reestablishment of unity among Christians as the Council's distant goal. For churchmen, this interest and this hope constitute a great Christian responsibility before the world. What world? A world in which 1 person in 4 is Chinese. A world in which 1 person in 3 lives under a communist regime. A world in which Christians are divided, but where there is also ecumenical hope. A world of practical atheism in an immense number of people. A world of technology and of an almost general conviction among the young that human beings have the power, thanks to this technology, to organize human life rationally and successfully by themselves. A world which denounces colonialism and any sort of paternalism. A world in which women are advancing. To my mind, wrote Congar, all the work of the Council should be undertaken as if the eyes of this very world, as if it were watching us, and with consideration of the realities I have just too briefly evoked. It was, in the end, this world that the Council sought to address, and this context to which the Church would need to adapt its ways of proclamation and witness. Since the French Revolution, Catholicism had largely styled itself as a wounded yet morally superior force, a closed parallel society that stood in judgment over and against a hostile and increasingly secular modern world. In many sectors, its anti-modern zeal had so turned in upon itself that the Church had largely lost touch with the ordinary working classes of European society. And while its missionary efforts had succeeded in bringing an important ecclesial presence to every continent, the Church continued to be perceived by many Asians, Africans, and indigenous peoples of the Americas as a foreign entity, at best disinterested and dismissive, and often actively collaborating in the uncritical condemnation and suppression of their cultural and spiritual traditions. The Jesuit historian, Father John O'Malley, helped us to see that over the course of the Council, the bishops chose to adopt a more open, engaging, and sympathetic approach to the world. 2,500 bishops from every continent gathered in this extraordinary synodal event for about 3 months every autumn over a 4-year period. For the first time in conciliar history, there was an important presence not only of European missionary bishops, but of African and Asian indigenous bishops, who began to seize the day as agents for the renewal of the Church in their own cultures. As well, the bishops witnessed the diversity of the Church and its prayer each morning as Greco-Catholic, Melkite, Maronite, Coptic, Syro-Malabar, Chaldean, and other Catholic bishops from the Eastern Catholic churches celebrated the divine liturgy in their own liturgical traditions. Many referred to this experience as a school for the bishops. The context of the modern world in the mid-20th century led to a 180-degree shift in social consciousness, writes O'Malley, and with it, a shift in how the church related to everything outside. In both its rhetorical style and its pastoral commitments, the teaching of Vatican II elected to present the other, including Christians, other religious traditions, non-believers, and indeed the whole host of peoples and cultures of humanity, in friendly terms, as bearers of truth and goodness. The Council, writes O'Malley, presents the yearning for reconciliation with the other as a dominant feature in its profile of the ideal Christian. The Council's rhetoric of praise and congratulation reflects this desire for reconciliation and collaborative engagement on multiple fronts. The Council, writes O'Malley, reconciled relationships between bishops and pope in its installation of collegiality in its decree on the church. The Council reconciled the church with non-Western cultures in its decree on the liturgy, with other Christians in its decree on ecumenism, with non-Christians in its decree on that subject, with non-believers in its decree on the church in the modern world, and with the modern world itself in that same decree. The Council thus defined the church as an essentially reconciling institution. This was not a new idea or ideal, but the Council gave it a breadth, a power, a clarity, and a dominance it had not had before. This brings me to my third point, Rahner's fundamental theological interpretation of Vatican II. Reflecting back on his experience of the Council in 1979, Karl Rahner offered his fundamental theological interpretation of Vatican II. He was grappling to understand the theological meaning of these events for the nature of the church itself against the horizon of salvation history. In a profound insight that appears to be borne out with the passing of time, Rahner suggested that the Second Vatican Council is, and here I'm quoting him, in a rudimentary form, still groping for identity, the Church's first official self-actualization as a world church. To be sure, the Christian Church, as the gathering of peoples from all nations, has always been a world church. As Lamansane has so eloquently observed, of all the great world religions, Christianity is unique in that from the beginning, it has spoken the languages of all the peoples. Spreading out from Jerusalem, it set down deep roots in Syrian, Roman, Greek, Persian, Coptic, and Ethiopian cultures. It has never been identifiable with a single cultural form, a single liturgical, theological, spiritual, or canonical tradition, as Vatican II itself would affirm. Vatican II embraces this broad perspective in its description of the Church as the new people of God, quote, present in all the nations of the earth, and taking its citizens from all nations for a kingdom which is not earthly in character, but heavenly, unquote. The Council sees the universality of the people of God in a small c Catholic Church that, quote, strives to recapitulate the whole of humanity and all its riches under Christ and in the Spirit. Still, Rahner was obliged to admit that this identity, a realization of the church's Catholicity, was always a world church in potency and less than fully realized. This was especially true in the Tridentine period, when the Latin Church, now separated from the East, adopted a vision of world mission identified with the project of European colonialism. Despite the contradiction to its essence, writes Rahner, the actual concrete activity of the church in its relation to the world outside of Europe was, in fact, if you will pardon the expression, the activity of an export firm, which exported European religion as a commodity it did not really want to change, but sent throughout the world together with the rest of the culture and civilization it considered superior. As long as it operated within the worldview of Christendom, the Western Church conceived of Christianity as a single, unified cultural form. Too often, it mistook Romanicity for Catholicity and uniformity for unity in faith. Rahner has no illusion about the fact that Catholicism remained highly Europeanized and Roman-centric, both during and after the Council. He readily admits that there is still a long and complex road to be traveled before one can speak of a church that is enculturated throughout the world to the point where one might claim that it has fully actualized its identity as a world church. Still, he was able to discern in the events and the teachings of Vatican II an initial realization of this new self-consciousness. Among the many signs which confirm his thesis, he points to the role of the College of Bishops at the Council as genuine protagonists, together with the Bishop of Rome, in the governance of the Church and the exercise of the pastoral teaching office. He speaks of the entire conciliar process as a, quote, qualitative leap, unquote, in the ways of discernment and decision-making, one which would be carried forward in the activity of the new International Synod of Bishops. He views what he calls the victory of the vernacular in the liturgy as a sure sign of the coming to be of a world church, one that confirmed the dignity and independence of the local churches and would call for further enculturation. In a series of the Council's teachings, Rahner recognizes a significant shift in the Church's self-awareness of its mission and agency in and for the world. The Church as a totality, he writes, becomes more conscious of its responsibility for the dawning history of humanity, unquote. This new consciousness is expressed unequivocally in the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. In number 55, we read the following: all over the world, the sense of autonomy and responsibility increases with effects of the greatest importance for the spiritual and moral maturity of humankind. This will become clearer to us if we advert to the unification of the world and the duty imposed on us to build up a better world in truth and justice. We are witnessing the birth of a new humanism, where people are defined before all else by their responsibility to their brothers and sisters in the court of history. It was especially in its teaching on the universal salvific will of God that Rahner saw the Council posing the necessary doctrinal foundations for the realization of a world church. These developments are most evident in the Declaration on Non-Christian Religions, Nostra Aetate, with its positive assessment of all that is good and true in other world religions, and in the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. By acknowledging the dignity of every human person and the inviolable freedom of the human conscience in matters of faith, the Council breaks once and for all from the triumphal model of Christendom. As Rahner puts it, the Church expressly renounces all instruments of force for the proclamation of its faith, which do not lie in the power of the gospel itself. Henceforth, its missional activity, following the example of Christ's own pedagogy, would have no force but the persuasion of an authentic witness. The final element of Rahner's thesis concerning the theological significance of Vatican II bears repeating here because it provides a perspective on the magnitude of this historic moment in the life of the Church, a moment he does not hesitate to describe as one of epochal change. He draws a parallel between the break between Judaism and the transition to a church of the Gentiles in the first century, what we saw reflected in the accounts of that so-called Council of Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles, and the break from the model of Christendom, or the transition from a Western church to a world church in our time. He ventures, quote, that the difference between the historical situation of Jewish Christianity and the situation into which Paul transplanted Christianity as a radically new creation is not greater than the difference between Western culture and the contemporary cultures of Asia and Africa, into which Christianity must now enculturate itself if it is to be genuinely a world church. So, my fourth point, does Vatican II have anything to say to the Church and the world of the 21st century? Against the horizon of this perceptive reading of Vatican II, I now turn to the question of whether the Second Vatican Council, in both its teaching and its way of proceeding, might still have anything to say to the Church and to the world in our context 60 years later. Let us first consider how the present context compares to that of the mid-20th century described earlier by Yves Congar. Over the last 60 years, the human population has more than doubled, and the population of Christianity has increased at a comparable pace. Today, 1 in 3 persons live in either India, now the largest country by population, or China. 1 in 10 persons live in extreme poverty. An unprecedented number, 100 million, have been displaced by violence, fear of persecution, and human rights violations. In 2021 alone, 24 million persons were forced to flee their homes by extreme weather events and environmental devastation, floods, storms, and droughts linked to the global climate crisis. All of this is giving rise to an unprecedented migration of peoples, one that is reshaping the ethnic and cultural mix of large urban centers and reshaping the cultures of our local churches. 1 out of every 7 persons today claims no religious affiliation, with the unaffiliated constituting the fastest growing religious demographic in Europe and North America. In the last half century, the centers of gravity of both the ecumenical movement and of all world Christianity have undergone a tectonic shift. The Pentecostal movement and new charismatic or evangelical churches, with origins in the 1906 Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles, California, have now expanded to the point that they have overtaken demographically the combined population of all other Protestant churches issuing from the 16th century Reformation. As you might imagine, this has profound consequences for the vision of Christian unity. While the percentage of the global population belonging to Christianity has remained steady at around 31%, most of that population has shifted from the Northern Hemisphere to the global South, where 2/3 of the global population was in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. Today, more than 2/3 of the world's Christians reside in the global South. The largest Christian continent today is Africa, with demographers predicting that by 2050, 1 in 4 Christians will be found in sub-Saharan Africa. The world continues to struggle against the enduring consequences of colonialism, and Christians, especially here in Canada or in Australia and the Amazon region, have begun to confront their complicity in the history of colonization, including in the systematic suppression of languages, cultures, and spiritual traditions with devastating effect. Finally, women's access to education and participation in economic and political life has improved in many societies. Nonetheless, the issue of violence against women or the prevalence of economic poverty among them is consistently identified as a priority by international human rights organizations. Similarly, while the Second Vatican Council made it possible for many women to have access to theological education and to serve in new forms of non-ordained pastoral ministries, the voices raised from every continent in the international synodal process presently underway have identified the need to, quote, rethink women's participation, unquote, in the life and ministries of the church, as well as its processes of discernment and decision-making, need this rethinking in a way that better honors their baptismal dignity. While signs of some of these developments were on the horizon in the 1960s, the Second Vatican Council had no way of predicting the dramatic rise of the human population, the emergence of a global ecological crisis accompanied by mass extinctions or pandemics. One might consider the papal decision to take the questions relating to human sexuality off the table at Vatican II, including discussions of priestly celibacy or the use of artificial means of birth control, as an unfortunate kicking of the can down the road, postponing a necessary dialogue on a host of concerns, including a more adequate understanding of homosexuality and gender diversity. The dark side of this failure to face these complex matters of mature human sexuality has now revealed itself in a systemic failure to protect the most vulnerable members of the church through the scandal of pastoral and sexual abuse perpetrated and covered up by clergy in a culture of clerical power and omerta. While some progress is being made, as the magnitude of these failures continues to come to light, the response of many church leaders on these matters continues to beggar belief. Vatican II could not anticipate that restoring the dignity of the baptized faithful would lead to an explosion of new ecclesial ministries that still await a further integration into the ministerial structure of the local churches. Nor could it foresee that a church with a growing membership would be met by a collapse in vocations to the ordained priesthood. In many ways, these are new challenges arising from the reality of a living Christianity that finds itself in a new social context. It would be unjust, therefore, to expect that the teaching of Vatican II, or even that of previous ecumenical councils, could provide comprehensive answers to these pressing issues. Finally, the turbulent reception of the liturgical reform over the past 60 years suggests a persistent attachment to a monocultural form of Catholicism with roots in the form of Tridentine Christendom and the dangers inherent in looking to the past for a model of church apt to meet the challenge of epochal change. Pope Francis has been right to see that many traditionalist movements harbor a deep-rooted refusal to embrace the fundamental orientations of the Second Vatican Council, especially its embrace of God's universal offer of salvation to all persons and its commitment to make common cause with all persons of goodwill, those belonging to other Christian communions and other faiths or non-believers, as a world church engaged in working for the coming of God's kingdom throughout the world. Still, the post-conciliar liturgical reform has been met with both nervousness and hesitation, even in mainline Catholicism. The authority to adapt the liturgy to the needs of the local churches that Vatican II acknowledged as belonging to the bishops was reversed and only recently restored by Pope Francis. Efforts to elaborate more fully enculturated forms of the liturgy in Africa and India were met with a cool reception. If Ronner's theological interpretation of the council is correct, then we have only just begun the hard work of a true enculturation of the prayer of the church. Much more remains to be done to suitably adapt the forms of ministry and pastoral practice so that the good news of the gospel is no longer considered an exotic foreign reality, or the church a meeting place for foreigners and those educated in Western ways. A new and effective evangelization requires a fuller enculturation of the gospel in every context. These are some of the important challenges facing the global Catholic Church in our time. At a moment when all of humanity is confronted with grave questions concerning its very survival. The teaching of Vatican II does not and should not be expected to offer a definitive answer to every question, but it does offer a model for the way of proceeding and provides a theological foundation for the emergence of a world church. Pope Francis, the first modern Bishop of Rome from the Global South, is both emblematic of that new ecclesial reality, and I think in possession of a lucid perception of how these orientations and ways of proceeding that are drawn from Vatican II might continue to guide us on the course to becoming a more vital actualization of a world church. And so to conclude, I'd like to engage in a sort of free association and suggest 5 points which describe aspects of this way of proceeding, each of them deeply rooted in the learning of Vatican II and capable of pointing us into the way forward in this epochal transition towards the becoming of a world church. First, trust the Lord of history. No one expected the elderly Pope John the 23rd would call for an ecumenical council when he was elected in 1958. While on the surface, the global Catholic community appeared to be working just fine, he knew that beneath its institutional veneer, it stood in need of deep reform, especially if it was to meet the challenges of modernity. Pope John did not have a roadmap for the council, nor for the future direction of the human community, but called the council fathers to trust the Lord of history, who would guide them as they struggled to meet the challenges of this new epoch of history. Rahner does not hesitate to refer to his own interpretation of this epochal transition as a reading of salvation history. In Jorge Bergoglio, the Catholic Church has found another pastor who invites us to trust in the presence and action of the Spirit in our time, and is calling us to discern in the signs of the times what the Spirit is saying, how it is that we continue to stand in need of conversion and reform in order to carry forward the mission of the Church in our day. Secondly, the capacity for discerning the gospel has been entrusted to the whole Church. The Second Vatican Council, in its recovery of the image of the Church as the priestly people of God in chapter 2 of Lumen Gentium, and its recognition of the dignity of the baptismal vocation, affirms the co-responsibility of all the baptized for the life and mission of the Church, which effect both the lay apostolate in the world and with effect for the emergence of new ecclesial ministries. This has undoubtedly, this last example, the rising forms of lay ecclesial ministries, has undoubtedly been a source of destabilization for many ordained ministers. The corollary of this insight in the Council's teaching of the sensus fidelium, the Spirit-led capacity of all the baptized to discern the truth of the gospel, calls for new structures of collaboration, shared discernment, and decision-making. No one person or single group of elite practitioners can claim to have sole possession of the truth, and those who exercise authority in the name of the Church must learn to call upon the gifts of all, including those with special competencies relating to the questions at hand, in arriving at their best judgment concerning the appropriate paths for the Church. The Second Vatican Council was itself a privileged moment in Church history, where the pastors of the Church worked together with scholars and theologians, lay and ordained advisors, ecumenical observers and guests, to listen, learn, and discern the faith of the Church. Pope Francis is calling us today to attend to the sense of the faith of the whole Church in the development of new synodal processes. My third point, the wisdom of the local churches and their diversity must not be neglected. The Second Vatican Council, like all ecumenical councils, was an expression of the shared faith and communion of all the local churches. Its teaching on the particular churches represents a rediscovery of the dignity of local churches in all their diversity. As many of the bishops learned through their experience of conciliar dialogue, the unique wisdom and experience of the churches gained through their experience and insertion in diverse cultures and social contexts can be a source of enrichment for the whole Church, contributing to its Catholicity. Pope Francis has tried to enact this mutual enrichment in new ways. For example, in his habit of drawing from the insights of the various conferences of bishops in his teaching, or by calling attention to the plight of particular communities in order to call the attention of the whole church to pressing issues. This was especially evident in the Synod for the Amazon region, which drew attention to both the ecological crisis and to the need for a deeper inculturation of faith that respects the cultures and traditions of indigenous Christians. Fourth, the conciliar process at Vatican II was a step toward the recovery of synodal processes. Process matters. For more than a perfunctory meeting of the world's Catholic bishops, the Second Vatican Council was a process, one that has not yet concluded. It involved a long period of consultation and preparation, with local synods and meetings before and after the event. During the council sessions, there were public meetings, prayers, formal and informal consultations with experts, ecumenical observers, lay and religious men and women, commissions and subcommissions that worked during and between each session. And since the official close of the council on December 8, 1965, we've been engaged in a protracted process of receiving the council, letting it inform and shape the life and practice of the church. The council was a synod of the global Catholic Church. In recognition of the need for a more sustained practice of synodality and collegial governance, the council established the International Synod of Bishops and required the establishment of conferences of bishops in every country. One of the most significant receptions of the council that has been going on, perhaps under the radar, which is nonetheless of great significance for the future of Christianity, has been the sustained dialogue between the Catholic Church and other Christian churches since Vatican II. These conversations have given rise to significant new agreements on questions once considered church dividing. I would venture to say that without this sustained experience of dialogue, one characterized by a humble self-examination of our own church's ways of teaching and forms of ecclesial life, the Catholic Church would not be embarking today on a sustained process of synodal discernment, one which is seeking to mobilize all the baptized faithful in a process of mutual listening and discernment, and to foster a more synodal form of church. It was in the joy of the gospel, in reflecting on this ecumenical journey, that Pope Francis acknowledged that among the gifts, the many gifts the Catholic Church has yet to receive and learn from other Christian churches, is the gift of synodality. My last point, a world church is a church in solidarity with all of humanity. Among the most frequently cited lines of Vatican II's teaching are the lines of the opening paragraph of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. The joys and hopes, the griefs and anguish of the people of our time, especially of those who are poor and afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the followers of Christ. Nothing that is genuinely human fails to find an echo in their hearts. These few lines sum up the Council's conviction that the place of the Church is squarely in the world and in solidarity with all peoples, especially with the poor and suffering. Further on, that same Constitution spells out how the Church understands its mission in this new context. Instead of bringing good news as what Ronner had described as a European export to be imposed from outside, the Council describes the law of evangelization in terms of a shared conversation, a mutual exchange. Looking back over history, it acknowledges that next to its desire to evangelize and transform those elements of culture unaligned with the values of the gospel. The church has often been enriched and has drawn from the wisdom and insights of various cultures, philosophies, and scientific progress. Through processes of dialogue and mutual exchange with various cultures, it notes, new avenues to the truth are opened up, and the gospel message is clarified in light of their wisdom. The road to a fuller enculturation of the faith, a necessary path to becoming more fully a world church envisioned by Karl Rahner and first glimpsed by the Council Fathers at Vatican II, will entail this sustained process of humble apprenticeship and spirit-guided discernment. Thank you.
Catherine, you can hear my voice. I'm waiting for my video to come back on. But wow, there was so much that there's just so much in this presentation. I'm not sure that we need to give our audience a moment or two. If you have some questions and you would like to put them in the question and answer box, Catherine will be able to look at them. But I mean, there were just so many incredible things that you said. This idea, while people are writing in, if they do write in, I was struck by what you said about how new ecclesial ministries are destabilizing the ordained. I think maybe that's true also in religious life a little bit. You know, the rise of the laity is almost a success story, and yet if you're a religious or if you're a priest, it can be a very threatening thing. You know, what do you say to priests and religious who find themselves in this this experience of destabilization because the laity are coming to take our jobs? Can you speak to that for a minute?
Sure. I think that religious and ordained ministers took the job of the laity progressively through history. So there was a movement of clericalization of the church that we saw in the early Middle Ages. But in the early Christian community, there was a variety of ministries and a variety of charisms, and there was room for all of them to work collaboratively. Over time, they became accumulated on the backs of the ordained priest, for example. And so, for example, even the reintroduction of a permanent diaconate seems to be removing certain functions from ordained presbyters. It's not their job to proclaim the gospel in the liturgy. That's the deacon's job. And that seems like a very simple point to make, but it's one that to which there's great resistance. We find it very hard to imagine a diversity of ministries that complement each other and that are intended to work together to meet the needs of the church and help the church carry out its mission. So I think we need to, instead of, you know, looking at the laity and clergy or laity and religious as a kind of zero-sum game, we need to think again and ask, what ministries does the church have need of today in order to carry out its mission? And to say that, you know, we're all at the service of that mission. And even lay persons together with ordained ministers, our principal task is to enable the baptized faithful to live out their baptismal priesthood in the world each day.
That's great. I don't know. I usually get some questions. Maybe something is blocked here, but not to monopolize the conversation, but while you're here, with the few minutes that we have left, you know, a lot of people were very enthusiastic about the ecumenical movement right after Vatican II. And I've heard people say, well, there'll never be Christian unity because so many people in the Catholic Church think unity will be achieved when everybody comes to Rome. What are the obstacles in your view to Christian unity? First of all, what would Christian unity look like? And what are the obstacles?
Well, Christian unity won't look like the disappearance of the different ecclesial communions as they have evolved, but they're it can't be uniformity. And I think we see a model of that again in the first millennium, in the diversity of the Eastern Christian churches together with the Latin Church in the West. But Vatican II really didn't take much account of these new Pentecostal movements. It focused on classical Protestantism and Anglicanism, and then the Eastern Orthodox churches. So this has required mainline churches, together with the Vatican, to establish a whole new structure, a whole new meeting place, which we call the Global Christian Forum, for classical churches to meet with representatives of the Pentecostal and evangelical movements. And I think it's brought to our attention the importance not only of overcoming doctrinal difficulties or differences in our practice, our liturgical and pastoral practice, but it raises the question of experience. It's not enough to accept intellectually all the doctrines of the church to be fully Christian. One has to live it. And that's the message that I think that we're being reminded by some of these younger churches. So I think to be involved in ecumenical work today, we have to be multitasking, and we have to acknowledge we're not at the same place on the road to unity with every denomination. So it's quite challenging.
Thank you. I think you have a question in the chat box. Catherine, you want to pick it up?
Yeah, someone is asking whether I see the possibility that ministries will be sharing in mission parishes that are here in this country. I'm not sure how to understand the question. If it's the possibility that more ministries will be sharing. Well, certainly there are hundreds of examples in the United States and across Canada today. For example, when lay persons are now the principal administrators of parish communities who don't have a permanent presence of ordained minister, or we have itinerant clergy who are responsible for 2, 3, 4, 5 parishes in rural areas. We're going to see much more of that, and this will require that more laypersons step forward to share the responsibility for many of the pastoral and administrative tasks in communities. Our responsibility is to ensure that they be properly trained and prepared to do this.
Catherine, I think you have a comment in the box there.
So there's a question from a religious who says, I think religious working with laity, particularly in adult education, has worked themselves out of a job, even given that it's a challenge to expand roles that include the laity who have the competency to do them and to make room with grace. So yes, I can imagine that some religious might feel threatened perhaps by the fact of lay persons stepping up to assume some of these roles that were traditionally the ministries of religious. But it seems to me religious normally would ask themselves, then where are the gaps in ministries that are still requiring our presence? If we can entrust these other educative tasks, or thinking of healthcare ministries and some pastoral ministries to lay persons, I think there's still an important place and a witness. And I think don't underestimate the importance of religious and lay persons witnessing together, because there's a particular witness to gospel living that is given by the vowed religious.
I think, Catherine, we have one more question and time for one more. You want to read that one?
So it's a question here about the nuns. The author writes, I believe there's great hope for reconciliation with and move to work for the common good with the nuns who may have deep faith in God, but do not want to affiliate with the institutional church. What are your thoughts on this demographic in the future? We have to deal with this demographic in the future. It's expected that 25% of the US population will soon have no religious affiliation. In Canada, it's now approaching over 35%. So it's quite significant. And I think there's an observation in the question that the fact that young people in particular do not wish to affiliate or align themselves with an existing church should ask us, we need to ask ourselves, why do we seem so inhospitable? But we also need to recognize in them, there's still a sincere hunger, thirst, quest, search for meaning. And I think there's a possibility for working together, and perhaps that experience of collaborating together in service of the wider society will also open them up to the possibility of a credible Christian witness. And it's that persuasive witness that I think they're not seeing in many of our communities. So we have to look for ways to be more effective in our own engagement and witness.
And I think, Catherine, we had a couple of roundtables with different generations talking about their vision of the church, and certainly in the ones that represented the younger generations, even of those who've remained in the church, that was their biggest complaint. There is no persuasive witnessing of the gospel to people, and a fair amount of hypocrisy. So we have a lot to do. It's now 8:44. I want to thank you very much for being with us tonight. I took so many notes, and there were just so many things that you brought up that were so important to understand about the council, where it came from, the world in which it was conceived, and its responses. So I know we're grateful for you, Catherine, for the time you spent with us. Good luck with the rest of the semester. Merry Christmas to you. For all of you who are watching tonight, if you're local, you're invited to the multicultural celebration for Gaudete Sunday at our Mother House on Sunday, December 11th. And this is the last Vatican II conference for the fall. We'll be starting up again on January 11th with Sister Celia Deutsch, who will be talking about a Sister of Zion. The Sisters of Zion had a great deal of influence on the document Nostra Aetate, so we're lucky to have Celia with us. And our regular courses for the spring semester, 4 and 5 week courses, will start up again in early January with one on Scripture. And registration for those courses, which are free, begins on Monday, December 12th. So go to the Spirit Alive website and be sure to sign up. And Catherine, once again, thank you. Good night. God bless everyone. Have a peaceful and restful night. Amen.
Thanks, Bria. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye now.